My name is Peter Santos. I'm a veteran of the Korean War, disabled. And just a little background, I was born in 1932 in Boston, Massachusetts, the son of refugees from the Spanish Civil War. My parents could not speak English, but I graduated, I went to the Boston schools and graduated in 1949 from Boston English. Actually, I went to Boston Latin for a while, then transferred to Boston English, and also studied for many years at the New England Conservatory, where I became a well-known violinist in the Boston area, with the goal of, my dream anyway, of eventually playing with the Boston Symphony. Those dreams were shattered, however, in 1950, when the Korean War broke out. And I don't think many Americans realize the intensity and the depth of this war. It's one of those hidden mysteries, the forgotten war, as it's called. The war lasted 3 years, but during that 3-year period, America lost 57,000 soldiers, died. 18,000 are still listed as wounded. The government now has changed those numbers around, which bothers me, and they claim that 33,000 died, but there were, believe me, there were many, many more that died of hemorrhagic fever, so I guess you don't call that battle deaths. But there were many accidents, and those people were killed due to the Korean War, which is about the same number as we had in the Vietnam War. But the Vietnam War lasted 10 years versus 3. And America was fighting in Korea with about 42 other nations. But America was the largest, of course. I was drafted because I was too poor to go to college, had no money at all, had never been out of the city of Boston, actually. And I was drafted in 1952. The war was raging, and it was not going well. I wound up at Fort Dix in New Jersey. The first time ever out of Boston was to go to New Jersey. And from New Jersey, I finished 16 weeks of infantry training, which is what everybody did. We have 8 weeks of compulsory training, and then I had 8 more weeks for infantry specialization. And then everybody was shipped to Korea except for 4 of us. Again, you don't know why these things happened, but they happened. And I was sent to Governor's Island in New York to learn something about IBM machines. It was a 2-week program, but it delayed my going to Korea until later on in 1952. I landed in, well, it took 4 ships to get me to Korea, but I wound up being shipped over to Seattle, Washington, Fort Lewis. I was there for just a week or so, really just sitting around. And then we were shipped by boat by way of Alaska. We wound up in Yokohama, Japan. And then from Japan, I could tell a lot of stories along those lines. We all were carrying weapons with ammunition in it, which I thought was kind of interesting. I was 20 years old. And I said, geez, I can go around here and kill anybody. You know? But then from there, they shipped me by boat from Yokohama to Sasebo, I believe was the name of the place, near Kyoto, on the other side of Japan. Then from there, I was shipped by another boat to Busan in Korea. I went with a Turkish brigade, and there were about, I don't know, several thousand of them and about 100 Americans. And that was kind of an interesting experience. I'd never met a Turkish person before, and they were fascinated with the American soldiers, and I was just as fascinated with them. They were tough soldiers, I'll tell you. I could go on with that, but we'll just keep getting the story, going along on the story. Got to Busan, and then from Busan, we were shipped up to Daegu, which had become our headquarters because the Chinese were still in Seoul, or down close to Seoul, and we stayed there for a while, and we just were kind of outposts waiting for activity. And that was when I got my first scare, I guess you'll call it. Don't forget, I'm only a kid. And on that train going from Busan to Daegu, we went through various railroad stations, and there I would see so many soldiers on the platform with red crosses all around. I don't know if they were dead or wounded, but I had never seen anything like that. And I started realizing that this is getting kind of serious. We got up to eventually we got all the way up to Seoul, and I wound up in the 8th Army headquarters, basically because of that little IBM training that I had. I was now put into military intelligence. The thing that was interesting about that is, even though I was with headquarters, I kept getting shipped out to all these different places where the activity was. So I wound up getting kind of in the middle of war zones. When at first I thought being at headquarters, that sounded like a safe place because that's where the generals usually hang out. But they used to always ship me out to find out what was happening here and what was happening there. Communication back then was good, but it isn't nearly as good as it is today. So you needed to go up to see where the men were and what was going on and then report it back. And it was during some of those periods that I would wind up getting either trapped or delayed or something. This went on and on through 52 into 53. And I was way up front when all of a sudden the Chinese, it was really the Russians, but the Chinese, if fighter planes were coming along and they were strafing the whole area, and I was out in the front, and I could see these planes coming, and I said to myself, good Godfrey, they're going to kill me. So I went running up the mountain. We were in the mountain range, and I jumped into what we call a bunker. In World War I, we had trenches. In Korea, we had bunkers, which were nothing more than holes in the mountains. And we all had our own holes, and you had these mountains with thousands of holes dug in, so that when the bombs fell, they really would have a tough time hitting you. You have to have bombs that could make right angles. So I jumped into one of these holes, and now you see the guards are speaking. There was another guy in this hole. And so we were sitting. I always carried a book with me. I only had a high school education, with no hope of ever getting any further education due to lack of money. And this guy was sitting in this hole. And he was just sitting there waiting for the planes to go away. And I stayed in that hole for 2 days. We chatted, and this kid saw me reading a book, and he says, gee, you like to study, don't you, Peter? I says, well, I really like this history stuff, and it's kind of boring around here anyway, so that's what I do is I sit and read, and they're not going to be able to kill me while I'm in this place, so I might as well read and see what's going on. And I happen to be reading Winston Churchill's books on the English history or something like that. And we had good books over in Korea. There were little libraries that went around in trucks, and you could take any book you wanted. And so I was reading, and he said, why don't you go to college, this other person? And his name, I forget it, of course, but he had a long name, which I found out later was a Polish name, quite long. And I said, well, I don't have any money, so I'll never be able to go to college. He says, well, I live in a town that has kind of like a free college. I says, really? I says, where is a free college? He says, well, it's in Massachusetts. And my ears perked up. He says, Massachusetts? I'm from Massachusetts. Now, what are the odds of jumping into a hole with a guy with all these soldiers from all over the United States, and it happens to be a guy from Massachusetts? And so he said that he was from this place called Amherst, Massachusetts. I said, Amherst, Massachusetts. Gee, I never heard of Amherst, Massachusetts, but I had heard of Worcester. Don't forget, I've never left Boston. And I said, is it near Worcester? He says, no, it's further west than Worcester. So he wanted to know if I'd ever heard of Springfield. I says, no, I've never heard of Springfield. He says, well, it's near Springfield. I says, oh yeah, what's the name of this place? He says, oh, it's called the University of Massachusetts. I says, yeah, really? I says, I never heard of the University of Massachusetts. I had heard of Boston University, Boston College, Northeastern, Harvard, that stuff, but I had never heard of University of Massachusetts. He says, yeah, why don't you apply? So while I was in that hole, I got a piece of paper from my back pocket, and I wrote a letter to this place called the University of Massachusetts, and we had free mail. So when we got out of the hole, I threw it in an envelope. And that's fine. That was the end of that. The story goes on, a lot of other military activities, but for me, the important thing was that 30 or 40 days later, they finally had roll call, mail call, and there was a letter to me from the University of Massachusetts. And I said, oh my, there is such a place. I thought the guy was kidding me. And so the University of Massachusetts had written me and said, could I send them the records? Now, how in the heck was I supposed to get the records, my high school records? So I told them, why don't you go contact Boston English High School and they'll send you the records, maybe. I wasn't even sure of that, by the way. And that was the end of that letter. And 30 or 40 days later, I got a notice that I was accepted at this place called the University of Massachusetts. I still didn't know where it was, but I was accepted there. Well, we'll save that as the story goes on because it's kind of interesting. The battles continued back and forth, and the peace negotiations were taking place. Eisenhower was now the president of the United States, and I was up on another front when we were attacked, and I got hurt in a mortar barrage. It was a very dramatic moment, actually. I'd never been hurt in my life. I played ball and I played the violin, but my left shoulder was completely mangled. I got picked up by a helicopter and lifted out. Many people were killed in that raid. And the next thing I knew, I was off to Japan to a hospital. And I spent several months in Japan recovering from the wounds. And I said, oh, good. Now they got to send me home. Well, guess what? They sent me back to Korea because the war had now ended. And so they said, you go to Korea, go back to the outfit because they'll need you there because they need a lot of military intelligence stuff. So that was some of the battles that I was in. And I was there, well, just quickly, I had never seen weather such as we had in Korea. It went down as low as 40 below zero. You can't imagine it. If you want to read on that, read about the Marines up at Chosin in 1950 and how many of them were frostbitten if they didn't die from the frost itself. That was a horrible situation. I got a little frostbite, but 40 below is very cold, believe me. It's also 110 to 115 in the summer. So, believe it or not, I actually enjoyed the summer better than I enjoyed the winter better than the summer, because with the summer and the use of human waste all over Korea, you can almost imagine the smell of this place. The bugs were all over, and I don't like bugs all over you all the time. In the wintertime, there were no bugs, but in the summertime, there were a lot of bugs. But the weather was unbelievable. The mountains were very rocky and difficult to climb up. The Chinese could actually go up those mountains, and they were wearing sneakers. We had parkas, liners, woolen shirts, long underwear, heavy gloves, with parka. You could hardly move. And that's how we were fighting with these heavy parkas. By the way, the War Memorial of the Korean War down in Washington, you'll see a replica of a soldier with the parka. You get an idea. Those are big, bulky things. I'm sure that, and today they got insulated boots. We didn't have insulated boots. Well, that's basically my military. The war ended. I happened to be at Pyongyang, again with the 8th Army, and that was when the prisoner exchange took place. I wonder if you remember that all the American prisoners did not return. 18 of them stayed on the side of the Chinese. First time that it ever happened in history, where American prisoners of war actually didn't want to come back to the United States. Over time, I think most of them did, but I don't know about that. But the interesting thing for me was to watch the Chinese prisoners as they were being brought back. Truckload, we call them deuce and a halves, truckload after truckload after truckload of thousands of prisoners would be coming back. And just as they got to Seoul, which is the capital of South Korea, all of a sudden, I could see, because I was right there, I was taking pictures of this. You could see the Chinese ripping their clothes off, because we were only about 10 miles away from where they were actually literally going to be exchanged. And they would start to rip their clothes off, punch one another. I said, Jesus, those guys are crazy. But what I didn't realize was what they were doing was trying to show, as they were being exchanged, how badly treated they had been and how they had been tortured and all that kind of stuff. The whole thing was a hoax because they were well treated, the prisoners. You know, you're still a prisoner. But they were putting on display with their uniforms being thrown off the sides of the trucks as they got closer to Pyongyang, and it was there that we had the prisoner exchange. Things quieted down for me for the next several months as I got my shoulder back as best I could. I did wind up 30% disabled and have been collecting. I'm still legally a disabled veteran of the Korean War, and I get disability pay every month. Not much, but I get a little something. And then all of a sudden, now my dates get a little hazy, but I think it was the first part of 1954, we got orders to go to French Indochina. Well, you know, I was a high school student, and I was a pretty good student. And they sent me to Korea, and I didn't even know where Korea was. Now they were going to send me to French Indochina, and I didn't know where that was either. But the next thing I knew, I was with my gun and my bag at Incheon Harbor, where we were waiting to be sent to French Indochina, which of course we all know is Vietnam and Cambodia, that area, because the French were in trouble. There was great debate taking place in the United States Congress, for John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, was insisting that America send its troops, and of course the troops were sitting in Korea, that we send our troops over to get the French out of Dien Bien Phu and save the day for the French. Don't forget, I'm a high school kid, high school graduate. By now I'm 22 years of age, and I don't really know much about what's going on. I do what I'm told to do. So we went to Incheon, and there were great debates taking place in the United States Senate about whether we would send our troops, and that meant the Korean soldiers, now over. Don't forget, we had 500,000 soldiers sitting in Korea. And they needed a preliminary group to go over there to establish the paperwork and the headquarters, so that before the soldiers, literally thousands of them, go over. So I was one of 25 that literally sat on his bag. We had these great big bags with our gear, plus our rifles. And we sat there for 30 days at Incheon Harbor. We had a barracks, but that's all we did. We just hung around for 30 days in this. Now you got to understand that Korea had been devastated by this war. There weren't any building. There wasn't one building left in Seoul. It was a wasteland. Well, Incheon was even worse. It was a mud hole, and there we sat for 30 days. What I didn't know, but I found out later as a historian, what I found out was that there was a great debate and eventually a filibuster led by, of all people, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Senate Majority Leader, and Senator Stennis from, I think, Mississippi maybe, who was the head of the Foreign Relations Department, or whatever, saying that we should not send our soldiers to Vietnam, or to French Indochina. And after 30 days of these debates, I don't know what happened. They sent me back to headquarters in Seoul, so I never went to Vietnam. Strangely enough, 10 years later, Lyndon Johnson is the president in 1964, and he puts the soldiers into Vietnam, if you remember. And 20 years later, Richard Nixon is the president, 1974, and he takes the soldiers out of Vietnam. Kind of an ironic piece of history, and it was kind of interesting because I was part, in a very small way, I was a piece of that, and I found that kind of interesting. Well, I know soon I got back to Seoul, and I was doing things and trying to play ball. I knew that I probably would never play the violin very much anymore because of my shoulder. And then they said, okay, they sent me home. They sent me home the end of August in '54 by boat, 40 days. 40 days on a boat, you know. But you know, it was the best 40 days I could ever remember because I was getting out of Korea and I was still alive. I had no intentions of ever coming back. I knew I was a goner, and there were plenty of reasons to think that. But I got back around the 1st of September, something like that. And I went to this place called, well, it's kind of funny. I got to Boston, and I had my uniform. I still had, as a matter of fact, I was wearing this shirt, you know. And the reason I wore the shirt is most of the guys were not particularly proud of the military, I don't think. But I wore the shirt because I could get free passage on buses and trains. So I went to Park Square in Boston to find a bus that went to Amherst, wherever that was. I still didn't know where Amherst was, but I had letters of acceptability, and I was all set to show up the 10th of September or whatever it was. So I got on the bus, and I asked the bus driver who went to Amherst. He said, yeah. I said, wake me up when we get there. So all of a sudden, I'm sitting on this bus, and it kept going. I didn't even know Massachusetts was that big. And we drove for 2 hours or something like that. The guy says, this is Amherst, buddy. I said, oh yeah, where's the college? So he points across the street from the park, where the bus was parked. I said, right over there. I says, oh, okay. So I went over there and I stood in line. A lot of guys standing in line. And so I stand in line, and I kept walking and walking. And I got up to the desk, and I says, I'm here to enroll in the college. And he says, what's your name? I said, Santos. And we went up and down the list, up and down the list. There's no Santos here. I said, wait a minute, I got a letter right here. It says so. He said, oh, you're in the wrong place. This is Amherst College. You got to go down to the other end of town. I said, is that where the poor kids go? I said, that's where I go. But I never even heard of Amherst College. That's embarrassing, isn't it, to say something like that around here? But those are some of my the high points, I think, of it. Well, of course, I went to college through a GI Bill of Rights. Wound up, since my shoulders were no good, wound up as playing on the soccer team. And I met my dear wife there in a musical show, because since I couldn't play, I was now doing a lot of singing and conducting and stuff like that. And eventually wound up in Longmeadow, where I wound up as the head of the history department in Longmeadow and taught for 40 years. And went in a different career. I kept in touch for a long time with some of my close buddies. I don't like to talk about it too much, but most of my friends didn't come back. Yeah, sure. A few did, and we kept in touch, but over time, things changed, and they went their way, and I went my way, and I really wasn't very happy about the whole thing. I really was trying. I had a very, very difficult time when I got back. I got myself back to the University of Massachusetts, and I wound up in I think it was called Plymouth, a dormitory. They were little teeny cubby holes, and it was built for World War II soldiers or something, and I was petrified. I was absolutely petrified. Here I had been through a war, been wounded, and I was more frightened to come home than I was to go over. My language was not what I would want anybody to know about, and I was afraid of myself, of what I might do. Yeah. I had been trained to kill people, yeah. And then they just dumped me and says, go home. Yeah. So I kind of went into isolation, and I stayed in this room of mine for a whole year. Never talked to anybody. I went to class. Every day I'd go to every single class. I'd take all the notes. I'd walk to the class. UMass campus was a lot smaller. There were only, I think, if I recall, there were 4,000 students at the school total in those days. I was there from 54 to 57 when I graduated. I'd go to the classes. I fell in love with the history teachers, professors, and said, how can they know so much? And then I'd come back and lock my room. I wouldn't talk to anybody. Eventually, a young fellow about 4 doors down, always had classical music on. And so I went down, and the fellow's name was Jack Bryn, as a matter of fact, and he was a math whiz. And I was not very good at math, but he wasn't very good at history. And so he tutored me in math, and I tutored him in history, and we both were able to pass what needed to be passed, because you had certain requirements. And Jack Bryn wound up as a math professor at Western New England College, so I kept in touch with him for a long, long time. But he was not a military friend. My military friends I kept in know, and even now I do get letters of reunions, and you know, it's history, and I don't want to go back to that because it's not good history for me. I saw too many things that I didn't like. The killings that were going on were very bad. But it was Jack that introduced me to a couple of other guys at UMass, and they brought me over to a fraternity house, and I made a lot of good friends over there, and I kept in good touch with them for a long time. And they got me out into the main, got me, cleaned up my head. My head was, I was sick. I was a very, and I still know that this still happens, that these guys go in and they come out very different. That's why I get very nervous about these military activities. They look nice on TV, but believe you me, it's not what you want your kids to do. And I was in Korea, but I surely didn't want my children. I have 3 sons, and I sure wouldn't want them to have to go through what I had to go. Now I have grandchildren. It's not healthy. So I'm a lucky survivor. I was able to overcome this. And I got graduated from UMass with good reports and got a scholarship to Boston University, and I did okay. But the military, I wouldn't, my kids don't know. I've already told you more today than I ever told my own children. I would never tell them this stuff. I came home a hero. I've got badges. This is the military badge. This is a badge that shows that I was under combat fire for over a week. Not everybody gets one of those, but these are what the reals are. You know, the politicians that make the wars, ask them to see their combat military badge, and none of them will have it. You see, they'll send somebody else over there, but none of them were ever over there. Some now, of course, you know, you do have people that were in the Vietnam War, but not many of them. And if we look at Congress today, not many of them saw military activity. And if they did, they were in some headquarters company in Washington, D.C., you know, and brag about it. Or they were shipped to where there wasn't any activity. Check the badge. This is the one you want to see. If they have that, that means they were really in a war. They were really in it. If they don't have it, that means they were sitting at a desk someplace. And those are the people that make the decisions for our 18-year-olders. I find it troublesome. Nowadays, the wars are all different. I know, you know, I don't think that I would be able to run away from an airplane that was shooting at me, and I could jump in a hole and get away with it. Nowadays, these machines are incredible. But, you know, war isn't healthy for people. It kills, and children die. But, you know, I'm not here to be talking about war, I guess. I'm talking about my own experiences. But this is what I came out very unhappy person. You know, you're 20 years old, you can beat anybody. Then you realize, you know, what war does, what bombs do, what bullets do, what for. And I bet you if you ask most of the people around here, what was the Korean War all about? I'd be interested in their answer. When we lost that many, by the way, I only told you what the Americans lost. I never told you what the South Koreans lost. And how about the Chinese? Mao Zedong's own son was killed in that war. Literally, and I'm not exaggerating, millions of Chinese. It was one of the most devastating wars. The United Nations claims 9 million people were killed in that war. You realize that this is only a little peninsula. It's only a small little place. But there were millions, hundreds of thousands of people that were killed because of this war. And I'm not talking just soldiers. I'm talking about civilians die in war too, you know. Well, that's kind of my story.
It's a good story.
You know, that's a summary. I mean, if you wanted to go day by day, we could do that too. But I was not an officer. I was offered a chance to go to OCS, and I didn't go. And the reason I didn't go was that to sign up to be an officer would put me in a higher level. I would get more pay. My best pay as a corporal up on the front lines where you get extra hazard pay was $180 a month. If I could have been a second lieutenant, and I would have got many hundreds of dollars more. I don't know what they were getting. But it also would mean that I would have to stay in the military for 2 more years. And I wasn't interested in staying in. I was interested in doing what I had to do and get out. I put in my 2 years. That was the requirement for a drafted soldier, and we got out. I never did anything with reserves or National Guard. I don't want to pretend to be a hero. I was a hero. I got all kinds of medals to show it, but I never intended to be an unintended hero. Yeah. You know, with all kinds of. Strangely enough, and maybe this is a good closing spot. Strangely enough, the Korean government actually gave the American soldiers a medal, which I got about a year or a year and a half ago. It was a 50th anniversary. And I have the medal here. I think it'll be put on display somewhere, with a letter from the president of South Korea thanking us for the sacrifices that we made. And I guess that it's very unusual to allow another country, a foreign country, to give Americans. Americans give us badges, but it's unusual for foreign countries to be allowed to give a badge to an American. So I have mine, which I have, and I have it on display at my house, and so my grandchildren can see it, but we never talk about it. I said, well, that's nice.
That is a good stopping point.
That's a good stopping point.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.